100 years ago, a city was born in the heart of the Okanagan, and Kelowna has been seducing visitors ever since. Blessed with a gentle climate, a spectacular lakeside setting, and the enviable reputation of being one of the best places to live in Canada. Since its incorporation in 1905, Kelowna has just kept growing. It's now the largest city in the interior of the province, and it's become an international tourist destination. Get ready for a nostalgic journey through Kelowna's first 100 years. It's time to revisit some of the most important and colorful chapters in our city's history. Kelowna is so green and attractive today that it's hard to believe the first settlers discovered a dust bowl. Local creeks irrigated a few small farms, but during the summer heat, the creeks would inconveniently dry up. What Kelowna needed was a reliable water supply. In the late 1800s, a number of private investors realized that Kelowna had the potential to become one of the most productive apple-producing regions in the British Empire, if only it weren't so dry. Luckily, there were numerous lakes in the surrounding mountains, and they inspired a water rush. Huge dams were built, turning lake chains into reservoirs. Skilled engineers carefully laid out a network of flumes and pipes. It was Kelowna's first mega project. By 1910, up to 40,000 acres of land had been irrigated. Ranches were replaced by orchards. There was a huge boom in real estate. Immigrants flocked to the region to grow fruit. It was decided irrigation was too important to leave in the hands of businessmen. In 1918, the provincial government stepped in and the first irrigation districts were created. The challenge they faced then is much the same as it is today. Agriculture, industry, and residential development depend on cheap, plentiful water. Irrigation played a huge role in Kelowna's first century. It'll be even more important in the future. Grass and gold. This odd combination led to a colorful chapter in Kelowna's history. In the mid-1800s, cattle ranchers in Oregon realized they could sell a lot of beef to gold miners in northern BC. Big cattle drives passed through the Okanagan on the way to the gold fields. There was a lot of fine grazing in the Kelowna area, and the bunch grass attracted the attention of some far-sighted cattle drovers. The Crown Colony of British Columbia wanted to encourage settlement, so thousands of acres of prime land was given away or sold for a pittance. Before long, most of the best land around Kelowna was owned by a handful of ranchers. Okanagan natives played a big role in these huge spreads. Superb riders, they readily adapted to the cowboy lifestyle. The era of the big ranches lasted less than a half-century. Ranchers faced problems ranging from overgrazing to cheap beef imports. They discovered there was more money to be made in subdividing property than in raising beef. Property development companies bought up thousands of acres of ranch land, put in irrigation systems. Fruit trees replaced herds of cattle. Although their golden era was short-lived, the early ranchers and cowboys put their bold stamp on Kelowna's first century. The first highway to Kelowna was Okanagan Lake, and for many years, lake transportation was essential to the community's survival. Early settlers discovered that the native dugout canoe was the most efficient way of moving goods and people. By the 1880s, a small flotilla of primitive private vessels brought supplies and new immigrants to Kelowna. Then began one of the most romantic chapters in the city's history, the era of the stern wheelers. Between 1893 and 1935, the CPR serviced Kelowna with a small fleet of stern wheelers, including the magnificent SS Sycamoose. The arrival of the railway eliminated the need for stern wheelers, but it also marked the beginning of a new form of lake transport. Huge barges loaded with railway cars plied the lake between Kelowna and Penticton for nearly 70 years. One of the main reasons the Okanagan Lake Floating Bridge was built with a lift span was so it could accommodate the tugboats. The need to get automobiles across the lake spawned another form of lake transport, the ferry. Kelowna had 3 overworked ferries to handle car traffic till the opening of the bridge in 1958. Working vessels aren't as common on Okanagan Lake as they once were, but tugs still haul giant log booms to the sawmill at Manhattan Point. They're a reminder of the importance of lake transportation to Kelowna's first century. Kelowna's early settlers were always looking for the perfect crop to grow in a semi-arid climate, and one of the first experimental crops, and one that seemed to show some potential, was tobacco. By the 1890s, quite a few Kelowna farmers believed that tobacco held more promise for the future than fruit trees. The industry got off to a promising start. It wasn't long before local tobacco growers had about 500 acres of the addictive crop under cultivation. They hoped the Okanagan would become the Cuba of the North. Kelowna's fledgling tobacco industry attracted the attention of major investors. A large cigar factory was built in 1912. It employed 200 people and had the capacity to turn out 25 million cigars a year. However, actual production was only a fraction of that, and the factory closed 2 years later, a victim of mismanagement and low world prices. There are a number of factors behind the demise of Kelowna's tobacco industry. Prices collapsed during the Depression of the 1930s. Tariffs imposed by the federal government made the cost of Okanagan cigars and pipe tobacco prohibitively high. There was also stiff competition from growers in Ontario who were closer to the major markets. Nowadays, only a few remnants of the tobacco industry remain, including this barn. A curious chapter in the city's agricultural history is passed into memory. Imagine hundreds of men, women, and children, often dressed in their Sunday best, voluntarily performing back-breaking labor in rattlesnake-infested wilderness. It really happened. The effort to build the Naramata Road is one of the oddest chapters in Kelowna's history. In the 1930s, Kelowna was still relatively isolated. The Okanagan Lake Bridge was a distant dream. Local residents were always complaining about the ferry service. Every year, Kelowna's business leaders would ask the provincial government to build a road to Naramata along the east side of Okanagan Lake, and each time the request was ignored. In a rousing display of civic pride, Kelowna citizens vowed to build the road themselves through 25 miles of mountainous terrain. Work began in 1936 at the depths of the Depression when money was in short supply. Crews of up to 200 people enthusiastically trooped into the bush to work, often going directly from church. Working with shovels and rakes, volunteers received shovel shekels, certificates that made them eligible to win prizes donated by local merchants. Work continued steadily till 1939, when World War II completely overshadowed the volunteer project. Although the Naramata Road was only half completed, it still provides access to Okanagan Mountain Provincial Park, a rocky reminder that you should never underestimate Kelowna's civic pride. The Okanagan Lake Bridge doesn't get much respect nowadays, considering it's one of Kelowna's best-known landmarks. Frustrated by congestion and mechanical malfunctions, most residents can't wait for the bridge to be replaced. It wasn't always this way. The bridge was once considered an engineering marvel. Public impatience led to the birth of the bridge. In the 50s, a fleet of 3 ferries moved cars from Kelowna to West Bank and couldn't meet demand. Motorists complained about long lineups and 2-hour waits. In 1952, a Kelowna businessman became Premier of BC. Legendary W.A.C. Bennett was determined to bridge the lake. Engineers discovered the lake bottom couldn't support a massive fixed structure, so they recommended a floating bridge, a major technological undertaking for the time. The project moved with astonishing speed. Construction was started in 1956 and took less than 2 years to complete. Proudly advertised as the longest floating bridge in the British Commonwealth, Princess Margaret attended the opening ceremonies in July of 1958. All of a sudden, the lake was no longer a barrier, could be crossed in less than a minute. Tourists flocked to the Okanagan in ever-increasing numbers. Industry began to spring up in a community that was still largely rural in outlook. It was the beginning of a population boom that continues to this day. The Kelowna Regatta owes its existence to homesick Englishmen who wanted to continue the British tradition of holding summer regattas. The first official Kelowna Regatta was held in 1906, just a year after the city was incorporated. At that time, most of Kelowna's population was of British descent or recent immigrants from the old country. The first regattas were modest affairs, featuring a handful of swimming and boating competitions, but within a few years, regatta had grown into a major 4-day festival that attracted aquatic teams from around the province. In the 50s and 60s, the Kelowna Regatta had a reputation as one of the country's biggest outdoor events. The regatta parade attracted floats and marching bands from across Canada. Tourists flocked to the city to watch powerboat races and other aquatic activities. Regatta began offering different types of entertainment, including aerobatic teams. In 1969, the U.S. Navy Blue Angels made an appearance at Regatta. One of the jets broke the sound barrier and smashed nearly every window in downtown Kelowna. The same year, Kelowna's magnificent aquatic center was destroyed by fire. Regatta lost its home and went into gradual decline. Regatta has survived fire, riots, and changing public tastes, but it continues as a family festival, secure of its place in history as a big part of Kelowna's first century. Kelowna's population and construction boom has gone on for so long, it's hard to believe there was once a lot of skepticism about the city's future. When the city incorporated in 1905, it only had about 600 inhabitants. Vernon and Penticton both had better transportation links to the outside world, especially road and rail, so many people felt these communities had greater potential for growth and prosperity. For the first 50 years of its existence, Kelowna enjoyed steady but modest growth. The first major population boom occurred at the end of the Second World War, when land was made available for returning veterans. One of the limits to Kelowna's early development was its relative isolation. That changed in 1949 when the Hope-Princeton Highway opened. Less than a decade later, the Okanagan Lake Floating Bridge opened, prompting a huge influx of industry and residents. Every time the transportation system was improved, Kelowna seemed to get an influx of new arrivals. The trend continued with the opening of the Rogers Pass, the construction of the Kelowna Airport, and the building of the Coquihalla Highway. Now it's easy to get to Kelowna. People come as tourists, fall in love with the scenery and climate, and decide to move here. With a reputation as one of the best places in Canada to live, Kelowna appears set for unlimited growth as it enters its second century. Kelowna's first 100 years has been a remarkable success story, and people who live here don't understand why you'd want to live anywhere else. So with pride in the past and confidence in the future, Kelowna is ready to face the challenges of its second century.
This celebration of Kelowna's first century was proudly presented by Interior Savings Credit Union, Boyd Auto Body and Glass, and by the Okanagan's very own CHBC.